finally halted the trials. 19 had been executed, 5 had died in prison, 1 man had been pressed to death for refusing to speak, and very quickly, in a sense, the spell broke and people wondered what on earth had happened. By the time the trials ended, almost everyone agreed that something had gone terribly wrong. But the population couldn't agree on what had gone wrong. Publishing any talk of the trials was prohibited, even though that ban was quickly broken. Since 1695, there have been many interpretations, and American literature has grappled with what happened with the Salem witch trials, and what does it say about the character of early America? Here's what happened in Salem. The events described as witchcraft first began in January 1692. Betty Paris, a minister's 9-year-old daughter, and Abigail Williams, a minister's 11-year-old niece, were the first to be afflicted. As members of the minister's household, this was an embarrassing situation. It suggested that Satan could make his way and afflict anyone's household and possess or demonize beyond a minister's ability to protect or defend. Puritan theology taught that such afflictions came as chastisements from God, which required the minister, Samuel Paris, to examine his ways and repent. Paris didn't suspect witches for many weeks, either because of his embarrassment or because he genuinely repented. He prayed and fasted and waited, and after more than a month of fits in his household, he finally called a doctor. When the doctor pronounced the girls bewitched, it added a new burden. The girls weren't possessed, they were being attacked. But who was bewitching them? Paris's neighbor, Mary Sibley, knew one way to find out. She ordered Paris's slaves, Tituba and John Indian, to bake a witch cake, which was a rye bread mixed with urine from the afflicted children. This was called counter magic or white magic and widely practiced in Puritan New England. Although uniformly condemned by the clergy, since they believed that any form of magic worked only through the power of Satan, the practice of counter magic, trying to use supernatural means to overcome evil with good, continued into the 17th and 18th centuries. Lay people didn't necessarily associate magic with the devil, but just thought that if it healed, it was good magic, and if it harmed, it was bad magic. Apparently, the witch cake worked. When the dog ate it, the children identified their tormentors. However, the same day the witch cake was baked, 2 more children fell ill. 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. and 17-year-old Elizabeth Hubbard, the doctor's maid. The 4 girls collectively named 3 witches, and Samuel Paris had good reason to be relieved. Now he could finally lay the blame elsewhere. Not only were these witches the ones at work, but Sibley's condemned usage of counter magic had done something to summon the devil in Salem. He rebuked Sibley and forced her to confess before the church. Then he used the evidence she procured through counter magic to begin proceedings against the witches. The first suspects were Tituba, a slave from the West Indies, Sarah Good, a poor beggar, and Sarah Osborne, a bedridden widow who scandalized the town by marrying her servant. These early witch hunts were directed at women, and especially at poor, marginalized women, especially those who transgress social norms. Carol Carlson commented that the story of witchcraft is primarily the story of women, especially in its Western incarnation. Witchcraft confronts us with ideas about women, with fears about women, with the place of women in society, and with women itself. It confronts us with systematic violence against women. Now, that might be true at Salem, but in this podcast, I've looked at medieval witchcraft and how women weren't necessarily the recipients of this, and in some places like Finland, men were exclusively blamed for witchcraft, for being warlocks. So the association of charges of witchcraft and violence against women can be true, but I argue that it's not universally true, only if we cherry pick the data. So Salem began as a limited witch hunt aimed at notorious women. The local magistrates, John Hawthorne, Jonathan Corwin, and Bartholomew Genny, presided over the first phase of examinations. Beginning with Sarah Good, Hawthorne interrogated the defendants in an attempt to force confessions. Questions led with an assumption of guilt. Rather than asking whether Good injured the 4 children, Hawthorne asked why she did it. Good claimed her innocence, and each denial of guilt evoked a series of fits from the 4 afflicted girls. Finally, Good accused Osborne, but when the magistrates examined Osborne, much the same occurred. But it was when the court finally heard from Tituba that Salem exploded into an unprecedented affair. Tituba confessed to being a witch under Hawthorne's pressure, and that confession yielded several dramatic results. First, the afflictions of the girls ceased, confirming that confessions were the best way to prevent future harm to the girls and to legitimate the actions of the court. Also, Tituba's confession enabled her to detail the actions of other witches, her supposed accomplices. According to the trusted Puritan theologian William Perkins, a confessed witch who accused others offered valid testimony against them. Tituba explained that Good and Osborne had forced her to harm the girls, and the court believed her. So you see this constant shifting of blame that's going on. Tituba also offered several elements in her confession, all guided by Judge Hawthorne, that became routine in future confessions, mentioning the devil's book, the witches' meetings, descriptions of a black man, satanic masses, and the naming of other suspects. Tituba claimed also that Good and Osborne didn't act alone. She eventually testified to a total of 9 witches, but she couldn't say who they were. Suddenly, a full witch conspiracy was underway, in which Puritan residents of New England thought they were in the middle of a spiritual war. Now there was a quest to unmask these foes. Ann Putnam Jr. took the lead in identifying these other witches. One identified was Dorothy Good, Sarah's 4-year-old daughter. Then Martha Corey, a member of Samuel Parish's church, and Rebecca Nurse, a widely respected matriarch and member of the nearby Salem Town Church, and a grandmother in the community. Those who acted as if they were afflicted multiplied. Adults began to suffer fits, including Ann's mother and Tituba's husband, and the fit spread to Mary Warren, the servant of John and Elizabeth Proctor. John Proctor responded by beating her, which seemed to cure her of the problem, and he said that if he were left alone with Tituba's husband, John Indian, he could beat the devil out of him as well. When Mary recovered and returned against the afflicted turned against her. She was accused of witchcraft herself. Before the judges, Mary claimed that the afflicted persons did but dissemble. Fits ensued, and they were so convincing in their performance that Mary reacted with fits of her own to show that she herself was bewitched, and taken back to prison, unable to speak. Mary confessed the next day in court to signing the devil's book, but only because she had been tricked into doing it by the Proctors. Then she accused Giles Corey. She rejoined the ranks of the afflicted and spun out accusations in tandem with them, which saved her own life but cost the lives of many more. These examinations of accused witches continued, but until June, they hadn't been able to proceed to actual trials because the colony lacked an official charter and an ability to try capital offenses. The newly appointed governor, William Phipps, arrived from England in June with a new charter, hearing about the crisis in Salem, and immediately established a court of oyer and terminer, or to hear and determine. Full of high-ranking officials from Boston, the court could move from the initial depositions, testimonials, and examinations to grand jury indictments and final jury trials. The court first tried Bridget Bishop on June 2nd. The trial proceeded quickly, and on June 10th, she was hanged. The Salem witch hunt paused at this point. Accusations and examinations had swept up a series of accused witches, mostly from the vicinity of Salem Village, but now it had executed its first witch, a woman who refused to confess even on the scaffold. Before proceeding, the magistrates wanted some approval from Puritan ministers. Asking their thoughts on the matter, several ministers took 2 days to respond. Their response suggested caution, especially in the use of spectral evidence, or seeing someone's specter or shape harming either oneself or another. The judges at Salem approached spectral evidence in direct violation of precedent and principle. Although the ministers urged caution in this regard, they didn't condemn overtly the proceedings or the judges, and ended by encouraging a vigorous prosecution. So this is what the court wanted to hear. The court pressed on, turning its attention to a second phase of the Salem witch trials to the nearby town of Andover, where a great number of accused quickly confessed. And many of them did so in hopes that this would save their lives with a lesser punishment. In total, at the end of the trials, 19 were executed, 1 man was pressed to death between boards, and at least 5 died in jail, until Governor Phipps closed down the court of hearing and determination. Phipps created another court to hear the remaining cases, and the second court cleared the jails, refused to accept former confessions, and acquitted all but 3. Governor Phipps immediately reprieved the convicted 3. No one else died for witchcraft in New England after that. All right, so what on earth happened? What are explanations of the Salem witch trial? Van Engen notes that most scholars agree on the basic narrative of the Salem witch trials. But why it happened is far from clear. What made Salem go so wrong? Scholars have always emphasized the role of religion in the Salem witch hunt, but it wasn't just religion. It was a certain type of religious understanding filtered through extraordinary circumstances taking place. It was sort of a perfect storm. In the book Satan and Salem, Benjamin Ray argues that far from being precipitated by a single key person or circumstances, the Salem crisis was a result of a perfect storm of factors. And this idea of a perfect storm is multiple factors coming together, such as King William's War, economic instability, the lack of a stable government in Salem and no official colony charter, the inexperience of the new governor, the past failings of ruling magistrates, the community feeling threatened by outside forces, and the personalities of Samuel Parris, Thomas Putnam, and many others. Overall, what mattered most, it's what these researchers argue, was that New England Puritans, in the midst of these crises, saw themselves as God's chosen people at war with a newly unleashed and angered Satan. They wanted to win this war, and the most self-assured Puritans became convinced they could win it by purging the land of all those who allied themselves with Satan and Satan's causes. They came to see the devil anywhere, and they sought to defeat him everywhere. Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, one book that has cast a long shadow on how we understood the Salem witch trial and other events of mass hysteria is the 1841 book, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. This book was published by Scottish journalist Charles Mackay in 1841, and he had 3 sections to the book: National Delusions, Peculiar Follies, and Philosophical Delusions. And just about everything we've mentioned so far in this episode, like the dancing mania, is mentioned in that book. And the subjects of Mackay's debunking include alchemy, duels, crusades, fortune-telling, holy relics, but then he includes other things like economic bubbles. And a popular quote of his is that men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. One example of mass psychosis that he gives, which I think is very interesting, is the phenomena of tulip mania. This was an economic bubble, and him likening an economic bubble to the same forces of hysteria as the Salem witch trials or the dancing plague is very interesting. Anyway, here's a little bit about tulip mania, and you can judge for yourself whether this falls under the label of mass hysteria. So tulip mania was a period in the 17th century in which contract prices for tulip bulbs, which had recently been introduced into Europe, reached extraordinary and preposterously high levels and then completely collapsed in February 1637. Tulips were originally from the Ottoman Empire. They weren't native to the Netherlands by any means, and they're attributed to being brought over by Ogier de Busbecq, who was the ambassador of the Holy Roman Empire to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And he sent the first tulip bulbs and seeds to Vienna. Tulip bulbs were then distributed from Vienna to Augsburg, Antwerp, and Amsterdam. And they were very popular. They were brightly colored. These were colors you couldn't see on any other flower. And paint was by no means mass-produced in the past like it is today. So seeing a brightly colored building could excite the senses in a way it doesn't now, and imagine what thousands of these flowers being planted could do.